Okay, so good morning, everybody. Good morning, Sonja. Thank you very much for coming here today. Let me switch off the transcript here. So today we have Sonja. She contacted me a few months ago. She's doing a Marie Curie in the University of Belgrade. Correct me if I'm wrong later about your introduction. And she's interested in the work that we are doing, our research grants, and especially in this notion of post-growth. Because she told me that she wrote me a very nice email flattering our group, saying that during all her academic life, she's been like trained in terms of thinking about growth, economic growth, as the main aim of economics as a discipline. No, and when she came across our group, she was struck by the fact that we are going into a completely opposite direction. And well, I would say that we are not alone. That there are an increasing number of people, also in economics, actually, I would say, that are start questioning mainstream economics and advocating for plurality in economics in teaching and researching. So we are not alone, and very happy. Javier is saying that this is a heresy, what I'm saying. But we are very happy that people from like you that are coming from a more mainstream background are also doing this shift. We also have mainstream economists in the group, or at least people who have been trained as mainstream economists. So we are a very diverse group. Okay, so a few words about Sonja. She's doing a Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska-Curie. She has a Marie Sklodowska-Curie grant at the Faculty of Economics in Belgrade University, and she was also around in this small university called Stanford in California. And well, I'm reading from her bios that her research is focusing also on how experience of post-socialist transition in Eastern Europe can help us to understand the evolution of capitalist political economies in the era of globalization. So I know that she's also interested in small businesses, and I expect her talk today to be about this topic. So no more words from me. I'll give you the floor, Sonja. I don't know if you have a presentation of some PowerPoints. Feel free to upload it, and then hopefully we will have a nice discussion with you today.
So yes, thank you, Mario, and also everybody for coming to this webinar, I guess I would call it. And my focus of my Marie Curie grant is on I call this sort of broadly the resourcefulness of smaller economic agents in the semi-periphery, and then I'll explain why I'm talking about the semi-periphery when I'm talking about Western Balkans through the presentation. But the idea here, okay, so my background is I'm a political economist, and I've focused, as Mario said, mostly on the post-socialist transition, but as a case of kind of like a bit of a speeding, like a zoom on how capitalism, works, and trying to understand the dynamics of capitalism from this perspective. So then. And something that has been a preoccupation in my work has been trying to sort of have a critical lens of analysis on this capitalist idea of catching up. So Eastern European, periphery since the fall of socialism in the whole post-socialist context since the early 1990s, there's been this focus on we need to now take over these dynamics of structural reform towards capitalist institutions, and then also induce growth and economic growth in order to catch up with the West. Of course, there's a big debate whether this catching up with the West is even possible given the institutional structural constraints, but we could safely say that even the EU framework of how they think about the core periphery relations is revolving around growth and catching up, and growth being the main tool for catching up. And then I also use semi-periphery as a concept in a lot of my research because it is really an in-between region. It's always catching up with the center, but nobody really knows what the center is because it's a moving target. I mean, there's different countries in Western and advanced capitalist economies, but they're also changing as well, especially with the context of globalization. So it's not really clear what this region is catching up with always. But then it's also the region is not really part of the development conversations of the global south either. So what Mario said, that I mean, I know there's other groups, but like doing work on post growth, but I've mostly come across it in the context of developing studies or like focused maybe on the global south. But somehow, and from my perspective, the problem with the Eastern periphery is that it's really kind of like completely captured by this growth discourse and catching up with the Western Europe. And at the same time, it's got like very weak linkages to even the post-colonial like debates and decolonial debates and everything. And there is a and then also something that is very specific about this post-socialist semi-periphery, but not necessarily also only post-socialist, but like, let's say deindustrializing or old industrial regions have been going through the same situation of having experienced de-development. So there's issues like maybe there was a certain level of development, if we want to call it from a broad economic perspective, and then there's been a decay of institutions like like education, health, public sector, everything's been decaying, failed privatizations, which have led to a lot of de-development effects. And this is like a term that's used in some of the literature. I don't know if you've come across it yourself, but the idea is that it's not only like this linearity, modern linearity of development, but we also see cases of de-development where things are going backwards. I don't know really how to think about it in terms of the time, but the idea is that certain places can regress because of globalization. So then I'm always interested in how this sort of, let's say, I mean, I think of it as a hegemonic logic of catching up, but then a semi-periphery does have some agency in these processes, and it's always renegotiating like what is expected of it. So this is something that is focused also in this research project of mine, but in other work that I do as well. And then because I've done a lot of work on this like different growth strategies and how welfare states are associated with them. So maybe a bit more focused interest within the literatures that I'm circling around right now. And I'm hoping that will also broaden through exchanges like this one with you, is that I'm wondering whether the semi-periphery could contribute new perspectives on this idea of growth strategies, especially in this whole era of technological progress and ICT-led growth, as they say. So this specific project, which is actually ironically called SEAGROW because it's like Southeast Europe and then growth, which I titled once I applied for the grant, was Southeast Europe's Emerging Growth Advocates, because there's been a lot of like emergence of smaller domestic firms that have been leading some of these transformations and economic transformations in the countries of the Western Balkans or like former Yugoslavia. And so while I'm focusing on growth, and I underline it here in this presentation, I'm focusing on the growth of Southeast Europe. I really want to unpack this concept of growth and wonder, is it only growth? Are we actually talking about a lot of dynamics that are also implicated in the post-growth literature? And perhaps we could kind of reframe this and think about it differently. So my project started in 2020 and I'm finishing it by the end of this year. So I've completed my fieldwork and now I'm working on analyzing the data that I collected through my fieldwork in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, neither of which are EU member states, but they are the EU periphery. And I am, so this is like very work in progress, kind of fresh. I've only been presenting it over the last couple of months, perhaps. So I really look forward to any kind of inputs and feedback. And also bear with me because this is still raw data, if you will. And then I focus on interviews with small and medium enterprises, but in the methodological part, I'll get to that. So just to provide maybe a bigger context of why I chose these two case studies and this whole concept of de-development is because, like, of course, yeah, I mean, everybody in Europe, I'm surely knows about the disintegration of Yugoslavia since the early 1990s and the civil war, and then like followed by transition to capitalism and to democracy. But then Bosnia specifically had a civil war from 92 to 96. Serbia had sanctions throughout the 1990s, then the Kosovo War, 97, 99, NATO bombing, 1990. I'm just listing a lot of these issues just to sort of grasp how many, for the people to grasp how many negative impacts on even the concept of development have taken place in the region. I mean, Serbia's prime minister was assassinated in 2003, then Montenegro seceded in 2006, Kosovo seceded in 2008. So throughout the 2000s, when the country was expected to be catching up, catching up, quote unquote, with the West. I mean, it really lost a lot of time from this economic perspective of catching up. And there's been, of course, a lot of destruction of infrastructure, and as I mentioned before, even decay of these formerly socialist institutions, including education, health, social services, etc. And but then. Bosnia is even more complicated because it's an ethnically divided post-war sort of two-level state. So there's a lot of ineffective decision-making, even weaker economic policy. It's not even an EU accession candidate. So I use these two examples of Bosnia with even a weaker institutional environment, although both countries are characterized by weak institutional environments and state capture. But I also wanted to have this cross-country comparison. Does it actually matter whether a country at least has a certain stability of government? And Serbia also has had a bit more autocratic features, some will say, over the past 10 years. So there's been a kind of like maybe growing role of government as well. But in this talk, I won't really focus on the differences between Bosnia and Serbia so much because I haven't really analyzed the data from that direction yet. I just wanted to mention why I'm focusing on these two countries. And then, but then the general story of the narrative catching up in the Western Balkans is we took over this theory from Central and Eastern Europe. There's these dependent market economies. They're called dependent because they are supposed to attract foreign investors, multinationals. They come to the region. They're drawn to the region by government subsidies and tax breaks. And then these foreign investors bring capital, technology, and know-how. And then all this entrepreneurial domestic class is supposed to form around these investors. It's supposed to be strengthened over time and then kind of integrated into global economy. And then somehow, miraculously, all this trickles down to local economic development. And of course, there's a lot of assumptions in this theory, but for those of you, at least with more economics background, I'm sure you're very familiar with this theory of how foreign investment is supposed to translate into gains for local development. But then in reality, what we've seen in this region has been very weak linkages between foreign investors and domestic businesses. Then we've seen state capture of business, which means that basically there's a lot of political decision-making, especially in bigger state-owned enterprises. We've seen very corrupt privatizations, which have actually focused on asset grabbing rather than actually privatizing, let's say, factory and then making it more efficient and like to create better products, for example. So a lot of people have bought factories just to get their assets and strip them off assets rather than have any interest in sort of like fixing the actual factories in any way. And then, of course, all this whole context of all these weaknesses has also translated into very weak support for domestic entrepreneurs, which are the focus of my research right now. And then the problem with this kind of lack of any kind of government coherent policy has led to very fragmented domestic business practices. We see a lot of small and medium enterprises, but there is very low interpersonal trust between them, weak cooperation between them, and they're all kind of sole players linking to international firms or global value chains on their own. So there's a very fragmented economy that we see springing up, especially over the last 10, 15 years when the region has gained maybe more developmental gains. And of course, along with that comes with this, there's this issue of spatial and income inequalities. And so we can't really say that any of this progress has been very inclusive so far. And the reason why I'm focusing on the SMEs as well is because Serbia's economy has relatively few large enterprises, even though those are the public or the foreign owned, but the SMEs, including micro enterprises and sole proprietors, they actually account for 2/3 of formal business sector employment and 59% of gross value added in Serbia. So it's a very significant sector. And then also, even when it comes to its contribution to exports, there's around 1/3 of manufacturing exports can be appropriated to or assigned to SMEs. And there's also at least as much contribution to exports when it comes to exporting services, which is mostly like tradable services, like even IT or like even film production. There's a lot of different sectors that are focused on service provision. And then also in Bosnia, the amount of SMEs contribution to the economy is lower, but still it's pretty present, more than half of gross value added and employment also in Bosnia. But the idea here is that actually there's these SMEs that are not just a marginal phenomenon in the countries, they are quite dominant players in the country's economies, but they, as my research will now show, my fieldwork is basically they seem to be kind of thinking about a lot of these developmental issues in a different way than we would maybe expect from like bigger or like even these foreign-owned enterprises. So this is what I want to focus on. And then, so why has there been this boost to SMEs and these exporting opportunities for them? Because, normally we think smaller and medium enterprises, well, they don't have that many capacities, they don't have technological progress, they don't have the ability to export so much because, their human resources are not as good as maybe for the foreign firms or the bigger firms. But then something that's really something really big that's happened with this whole industry 4.0, which is that the digitalization and technology has entered into the manufacturing processes. It is over the last, I guess, 10, 15 years as well, we're talking about. It is making it possible to decentralize very many production activities. So we have like smaller, spatially dispersed tasks. So somebody like different players or different economic actors from different parts of the world can produce like niche services or products that are then part of like a bigger global value chain. And that seems to be the case that a lot of Serbian and then followed by Bosnian firms have been plugging into these global value chains, seeing it as an opportunity because the region hasn't attracted much of the foreign investment into the country to like bring actual investment into the country and then have local players lean onto them. It's kind of like the local players went outside on their own and then found bigger firms in the international arena and started collaborating with them. So it's a very different dynamic. And even when it comes to these like micro entrepreneurs, online labor markets, people conducting services online, Serbia is like a world leader in digital work. Bosnia is in 7th place relative to population. This is ILO data. So something that I found really interesting in this project is that there's a lot of bottom-up, spontaneous escaping from this trap of like weak institutions and captured states, because it's not policy-driven. It's not that a government is doing this. It seems to be very grassroots, bottom-up led, like these companies saying, how can we change the conditions of these structural disadvantages and maybe do something for ourselves by getting out into the external markets on our own. And this is just maybe some data to back it up and also to contextualize stuff for you. On the right side, we see by GDP per capita, both Serbia and Herzegovina are really lagging behind even Romania and then Poland and Hungary in terms of its gains of GDP per capita, but they are increasing over the last 10 years especially. But then when we look at exports, especially in Serbia, actually Serbia has surpassed Romania. So there's definitely a lot of engagement, of which at least a third of is because of these SMEs, right? A lot of engagement with international markets. And then something that's very interesting for me also, which I would really love your feedback on, why I'm even is can this international economy somehow be more post-growth? Could we think about some of these processes also from the post-growth perspective, or is the engagement with the international economy on its own already to kind of growth and not able to withhold any sort of like a post-growth paradigm or be translated into a post-growth paradigm? So I would like to argue in this project that we could also think about this global integration from a post-growth perspective. So just to summarize what I've said so far is basically that we have this external environment that is kind of bringing threats in terms of like this winner takes most dynamics of globalization, digitalization, because it's very much harder to compete against these big multinationals because the cost of technology is also expensive, so only bigger firms can afford it. And then this seems to be leading to exacerbation of core periphery dynamics in the EU, even or beyond the EU, and growing spatial inequalities. And then in the internal context, for these countries, we have weak and captured domestic institutions and low trust, fragmented entrepreneurs, weak local ecosystems. But then on the opportunity side of things, from the external environment, we have this fragmentation of global supply chains so that these smaller firms seem to be plugging into this global economy. And there's a lot of dependence of international firms and multinationals on these smaller firms from the periphery, which is kind of like cheaper players, let's put it that way. So then my question here is, could we think about, which is the bottom right corner, could we think about these, maybe that some of the rules of this game, the international sort of catching up game, could they be changing from the bottom up? And I'm trying to also work with another colleague on like developing this kind of like new agenda on the political economy of local economic development, which I think might have linkages with a post-growth paradigm, but correct me if I'm wrong, and I would really love your feedback on whether we could merge these perspectives. So let's now move to the empirical part, which is the most interesting, probably part of the story. So as I told you again, the choice of the country cases was, weak and captured institutions, and then these countries are unable to turn their coordination between economic and political actors towards economic development. There's also a lot of literature on the middle income trap for a lot of Eastern Europe nowadays. So there's a lot of discussion of that this is actually a political capture and that these countries are not able to develop to any level because they're just stuck at a certain level of their ability to catch up with the West. And then we have this context because where we now see a lot of international but also domestic policy circles in the Western Balkans that, but the digitalization and information and communication technology is actually the solution to all of this, because ICT will actually produce modernization and development because it creates all these opportunities for small and medium enterprises. Of course, my take is, this is a bit naive. We have to understand how do these opportunities interact with the local context, and how do these SMEs, small and medium enterprises, make meaning out of these processes? Are they really focused on grabbing these market shares and growing, or do they actually have other concerns, and how these concerns fit into this whole hype now about ICT driven catching up? So the catching up discourse is a very economic growth driven discourse, but what I am showing in my research is actually there's a lot more than the growth discourse when it comes from the perspective of these smaller agents. So I conducted 58 semi-structured interviews with managers and or owners. Usually it is the same people who own and manage the firms of small and medium domestic enterprises in Bosnia and Serbia. This was conducted between June and December 2021. It was a very arduous work because I was on my own, and I had a very short time to collect the data. And I focused on domestically owned enterprises, but I didn't really focus on any specific sectors because of this fragmentation. They're working in so many different sectors that I really wanted to then maybe cover and see whether there's a common narrative emerging despite the sectoral logic. Because I think the sectoral logic is also a growth logic. It's like which sectors do we need to boost in order to grow further? But here I've covered all kinds of goods and services, from furniture to metallurgy to advertising, IT, film production. I've mentioned all kinds of different firms. And I focused on exporting firms because the idea from the economic growth perspective is that they're more competitive. But when I think of it from the post-growth perspective, so are they maybe the least likely cases to endorse this post-growth scenario? And if these least likely cases that are supposed to be competitive and fitting into the sort of economic growth paradigm, if they're endorsing certain post-growth values, then we might also kind of want to reconsider which agents or who could be the agents of post-growth, of a shift towards a post-growth paradigm. And also, my participants are geographically dispersed across both countries. And I just have to mention, because of course I do try to pay attention to issues of social justice whenever I can, but female-owned enterprises are really underrepresented among a lot of these exporters because most of the competitive firms are somehow not female managed. Of course, we can get into the whole patriarchal dynamics of the logic of economic growth, but maybe we can save that for the discussion or for another part. Okay, so in short, when I talk to these people, something that really struck me is really important is that a lot of them are very confident that, the EU market, it's increasingly turning towards the Western Balkans, especially after this whole post-pandemic rift with China. They're saying everybody wants to purchase goods and services from the Balkans. We're not worried about the market at all. We're not worried about growth or expansion. We're worried whether we can actually fulfill these demands. I mean, we're even getting more access to technological resources or machines, or even clean tech, like solar panels. They're getting all these financing schemes to finance a lot of it. But all they were talking about throughout the interviews is their preoccupation with human, communal, and natural resources. So it's something that really came strongly through my interviews is that they were all concerned about the fact that these human, communal, and natural resources in the region are decaying, and they're rapidly decaying, that it's impossible for them to run their businesses or capture more value for the region, even from all these growing exports, without actually paying attention to this side of the story. And And then they're saying, I mean, although the EU might be expecting us to be the new nearshoring outsourcing destination where, they could be now, but because they cannot order it maybe from further away, they could be like ordering a lot of these products and services from the region, but we just don't have enough labor. We don't have enough labor to provide this, to feed this outsourcing driven, labor intensive model of like economies of scale, right? Like where we're supposed to produce more and more. There's just no resources for infinite growth. So a lot of these people actually verbalize this as well, as in like specifically we don't have the resources for infinite growth. And and also something that struck me, although a couple of, or I would say like really a minority of participants said, well, we'll just import workers from Bangladesh or Vietnam, or because we're running out of resources, we'll figure out a way to get natural resources from like poorer regions even than us. Actually, a lot more of them were a lot more interested in how to figure out sustainable renewal of local and domestic resources. They were a lot more interested in that than kind of like passing on this extractivist logic onto the even poorer supra and like more and more peripheral regions where they could now be extracting value from and kind of becoming the middle managers. Only I would say a bit of more elite firms that I spoke to maybe, and very, as I said, a minority would say, well, this is our path. We'll be the middle managers between the poorer countries and the richer ones. And then we'll extract resources from the poorer countries in order to supply the West. So, but I was very pleased to see that most of these people were not speaking those terms, but actually speaking about like how can we think of strategies to renew local resources. So then maybe to get into some of the examples of this is the first issue of these human resource challenges. There's a lot of issues with labor and skill shortages because of the continually high immigration, especially since the sort of the war era, but even afterwards due to like lack of economic opportunities, and also very low fertility rates and demographic aging, right? So this is like a big issue, I guess, all across Europe. Then there's also the problem of decaying public vocational systems, which have not really been kind of revamped even since the socialist era. So there's a lot of like limits to access to skills training. So some of these people are saying, well, even if I could produce more, I just don't have the workers and I don't have anywhere to send them for training, even if I want to pay for it. So then they were, but something also like more specifically, they were complaining about and lamenting kind of the loss of handmade craft and art techniques, something that could really make more valuable products and kind of shift them away from this logic of mass production. So for a lot of them, they're saying, well, we cannot provide all this workforce. We really need to move away from mass production and think about like how we could maybe make certain handmade things that could then be sold maybe for a higher price, but at the same time we cannot be feeding the mass production model or like replacing China in any form or format. And this has also come up as an issue in agricultural labor because this is where we also see growing reliance on migrants, and they are then dependent on whether countries make bilateral agreements that workers from a poorer country can come and like pick fruits and vegetables or wine, grapes or something from another country. And I think this is also a similar dynamic probably in a lot of agricultural areas of Europe. But then also something that I found interesting was also they were verbalizing a lot about the general worry about the social decay and apathy in the local community, that also like people were just worried about issues of social injustice, of rising inequalities, which was also very demotivating for both their business and for the workforce. And so in that sense, they really kind of were thinking about how to get into the role of social reproduction, right? Which I find very interesting because I also do a lot of work on gender and social reproduction. It's like it's comes from my PhD work and some of the other projects that I've been working on. So I could really find a parallel between this kind of logic of social reproduction and all the concerns that they were worried about, which I mean, if you read like policy studies or government recommendations, it's always about market expansion and growth. But then if you actually talk to people who are running these businesses, all they talk about is social reproduction. And then another aspect of this social reproduction, even natural or environmental reproduction, if you will, I don't know if that term exists, is that they were also very worried about natural resources decaying and how they are able to access them. For example, Bosnia is a big furniture exporter, but they've had a lot of problems with access to timber because state-owned firms allocate timber and like other raw materials and resources. So they're always constrained by politics of state capture, who gets access to timber or not. And they've also had some situations where, like, foreigners, for example, from Arabs come and they buy off all timber for 3 times the price, and then the government takes it. So now there's been a lot of push for government to have to protect natural resources to sort of like favor local producers and businesses. So there's a lot of debates on that now. And then there's also like awareness of climate change, how it's putting pressure on usage of resources, especially water, to protect crops and animals. And also like a big lack is the insurance mechanism, where they don't really have insurance for a lot of these like climate events. And then even beyond this kind of natural resources, they also were very, very worried about accessing raw materials, which then made me realize something that I never really thought about before. But because a lot of the businesses and even this catching up model is very dependent on who supplies the raw materials to people who are then making. So if it's furniture or if it's clothes, then you have to get textiles from somewhere. If it's shoes, you have to get the heels and the leather from somewhere. And like, so who is basically in China, since China kind of has been removed as the big supplier with this whole like pandemic issue, like this leaves Italy and Turkey, which, I mean, for the Balkans, they have had quite a lot of informal networks, and they've been using them to resolve some of these issues, both domestically and internationally. But there seems to be a lot of informal activities around figuring out how to get to, raw materials and natural resources. And of course, there's also resource conflicts because of it, but there seems to be an awareness also that like this is not sustainable, and it is just a race to the bottom if everybody kind of starts grabbing these resources for themselves. So, but still there's low trust in formal institutions that could fix this. And what I mentioned earlier is that I really wanted to highlight this idea that there was a lot of thought about social reproduction, and I also put here in brackets, maybe also environmental reproduction efforts. I don't know if we could use this word, as I said, I don't know if I'm making it up. But the idea is that they're spending most of their time, even managers, a lot of effort on motivating their employees, managing them even emotionally in this whole environment of like, kind of like high stress, decaying issues, like problems with education, health, general, circumstances within which these people live and work. Then also a lot of the participants, especially because they lack government support, have seen their role as leaders in attempting to rebuild local resources. So they're saying we're actually building maybe private IT training centers or other forms of skills training in order, like through which we have to collaborate in order to help our workforce upgrade themselves, upgrade or learn more. But they were also more concerned about bringing maybe some infrastructural projects into the community, and also environmentally speaking, pushing out big polluters, trying to figure out how to protect local resources so that bigger companies do not get and scoop everything and kind of like abandon a decaying area, because they've seen a lot of that happening before and they don't want it to happen again. There's an awareness of that. And there's also this idea that they are very proud of doing more with less. So it's basically they're saying where we are less resource intensive, because we can come up with innovations that are going to save money also from our clients from the West, because we have less resources and we're used to kind of figuring out how to do things cheaper and how to do more with less. I came across also Mario's paper from 2013 on this frugal innovations. I really like that, so I think I'm going to integrate that into these observations, how like more developing and poorer countries have more frugal approach to innovation and less resource intensity in their innovations. And then also, even when it comes to technology, they're very much kind of against technology driving these trends. They're very focused that technology, if it's used, it has to support the workers. So they're very much against any kind of cost-saving technologies that would harm their workers, especially in administration and finance, where they think they want to keep loyal employees. So loyalty was like a really important thing for them. And even they're saying automatization is very limited, because for these kinds of production lines that we do, niche products, it is just like when you're not thinking economies of scale, there's just not much point in automatization. So just to maybe provide one quote from this furniture maker in central Serbia, they're saying we got some offers to digitalize our production processes, but they don't understand that this doesn't really work for small batches of luxury furniture. We have to adjust the machines way too frequently to gain any time advantage from investing in automatization. So this awareness that technology although it sounds like it's all supposed to be about technology upgrading and market expansion, they're very much kind of against this whole, they're going against this logic of economies of scale, and they're thinking about how to protect their human resources. And maybe the final point, I think I have a bit more time before I conclude, is that I also wanted to bring another aspect that I'm again still sort of thinking about and trying to figure out how to process, is these transnational networks of care, how I call them for the time being. Is that I also noticed that, from the interviews, it comes out that they are not really, even the way they engage with foreign markets is very driven by their personal networks, whether this is from working abroad or studying abroad or from diaspora connections, because there's a lot of immigration, right, especially in Western Europe. And this is something that is really, they're very aware that this is strengthening their business resilience. So they're saying, of course, my product has to have good quality and I have to have good skill sets, but at the same time, the communities that we have and the networks that we have, and if we're not engaged in mass production, really are like key for us to access the kinds of clients that we want and to not go for this like mass production model. And then also another one quote that I found interesting from this perspective of what I call the transnational networks of care is that people from diaspora want reasons to travel home for work or use their native language at work. So they would always hire a firm from their home country, maybe because they want to engage with it. And then another thing that came up as well was that they're saying, even if we are highly innovative, this has come up in the more innovative firms that are dealing even with the high technology products, they're saying diffusion of innovation takes a lot of time, so we need a lot of supportive networks. So for some of them who studied abroad, there was one case study of somebody who studied in Brussels, and then it was their professor in the university in Brussels who was actually buying their products until they penetrated the market. The products were very high quality, but they just needed time to sort of get into the, let's say, this competitive market. So for them, basically, the essential part of their business success was this transnational, I would call it again, a network of care, because their former professor cared about supporting them and using public resources and university resources to finance these purchases. Another thing that comes up from this transnational network as well is that a lot of the times, in order for these companies to get out of these captured and corrupt local institutions or national institutions, they go, and once they, let's say, make it in a foreign market, like once their products prove its value, it's some kind of a control mechanism for quality. So then once this product is recognized internationally, a lot of the times it becomes recognized in the country of origin, because then the government says, ooh, all these international people are saying that this product is quality, maybe we should actually consider it. So there's kind of also dynamics that these transnational networks of care are seeming to break up some of these like government capture of institutions, because it's able to kind of bring in better quality solutions to domestic institutions as well. And then also what I mentioned with this whole doing more with less and significant savings for clients is that there's awareness that these SMEs are bringing value beyond the low wage, high skill model, which has been the staple model for Eastern Europe, is that everybody comes there because of low wages and high skills. But there seems to be awareness that they're bringing a lot more to the table, which then brings me back to this idea of Mario's concept of frugal innovations and their recognition of value in that. Okay, so then I'll conclude just with some of the policy implications, which will hopefully open the discussion. So one thing that I want to highlight from that comes out from my fieldwork is this interdependence between smaller economic agents and communities within which they operate. And then basically that they are very aware that their ability to leverage social and political and natural environments within which they live is actually going to allow them to capture greater economic value for themselves, but also for their local communities. Of course, this is not always an equivalent. You can have extractivist local businesses. I'm not assuming that just because they capture value for themselves, this will automatically translate to the community. But the fact that they're dependent on the community might make them kind of spread these resources more evenly than would be the case of a larger firm. And like because of these, this crisis of labor shortages, the environmental crisis, and the general decay of local resources that I've talked about, there seems to be more awareness among businesses that are leading them towards more cooperative, communally oriented business strategies. As I mentioned before, of course, there could be, this could also be leading to them thinking about how do we extract additional human and natural resources, maybe from neighboring countries or neighboring poorer municipalities and raw materials. So of course, there's also this logic of the race to the bottom, but I would say that a great majority of them are aware that this is a race to the bottom and that actually sustainability and sustainable renewal of communal resources is the only way to survive in the longer run. And then I think this is the final slide. So some of the questions that I also wanted to bring up is, could we think of the global economy from this perspective of could we think about like these resource saving and communal regeneration strategies could we learn something from the poorer nations, or do we sort of go down the road of let's just lose this knowledge because we will push these countries to expand markets, innovate, get more technologically advanced, and kind of put them on these unsustainable patterns that we already know are unsustainable. So from that perspective, I'm wondering, could these firms somehow be recognized and rewarded for also not just adopting these costly technological innovations from the core countries and translating their models, copy-pasting their models of growth, but actually supplying something different there? And then I'm wondering whether this is actually something that would build resilience and resourcefulness into the entire global supply chain. So maybe if we think of the global supply chain as becoming more post-growth oriented, this would actually mean accounting for the resilience and resourcefulness of some of these like smaller fragments and actors in the global value chain. So then I'm wondering whether this would lead to us imagining a more post-growth oriented global economy, even whether like paying more attention to these exchanges and not only what the core translates onto the periphery, but what the periphery offers to the core could make us sort of think of the global economy from that perspective. So I'll stop there. And
Okay. Sonja, thank you very much. I mean, this was an amazing example of research excellence from theory to the empirical part. So really congrats. And I'm really sure that in the next months you will definitely have more research outcome that will be leading to fantastic publication. Actually, I'm excited to read what you are going to write. Okay, so we can open to the discussion. I have some point. Actually, I written down many things here, many notes. But I want to start with the other. I don't know if anybody has a specific question. Poonam.
Yeah, Sonia, thank you so much for a very nice presentation. I really like the way how you talk about hegemony of the term catching up, which is fantastic and applies very well to the Indian context as well. I would actually, and you can send me the details later on also. You don't have to definitely respond now. I would actually like more details on the kind of firms you interviewed. Like you said that there were metallurgy firms and this and that, but I would also like, because you're talking about people making niche products. So I wanted to know what kind of niche products they are and how are values embedded as compared to mass production. I wanted to know more about the niche, because you talked about translation and networks of care, but again, what are the products that imbibe these kind of values? So that was something that I wanted to know. Also, a little bit more, I wanted to know about the ICTs question that you raised in the beginning, because I'm also very much interested in this question of how digitalization will engage with the idea of growth. So I would want to know a little bit more about that. And a third, a little, discomfort that I had that I had to mention here is with the use of the word poor countries, because you're constantly talking about degrowth models and the way in which we have to reframe the discourse. But when you frame countries just because they have less economic resources in terms of being poor countries, it makes me really uncomfortable. So yeah, this is.
Okay, I think Sonja can have a reply, and then we can move on to the others.
I'm also happy to collect, but I can reply to this until people think of it. But yeah, thanks so much, Punam, was it? Yeah. I'll start with the last one. Absolutely spot on. This is what I mean when I've been also colonized by these words that I'm trying to escape from. So this is why also I really want to exchange with a community like yours, because it's going to help me to sort of like use the language that I should be using, because the catching up discourses, of course, hegemonize me as well through all these years of practice. So thank you very much. Please do mention any discomfort. That was the whole point of me wanting to talk to this group of people. So maybe I'll start with the theoretical. So if I understood your question on the digitalization and growth, the literature that I've been reading, I have not really, which I guess, I mean, it's more your specialization, the whole logic of post-growth innovation. The idea of ICT, like what I've seen in terms of evidence, is that digitalization has on one hand led to a more winner takes most dynamics, because of course technology is expensive and only the people or companies that can, like governments that can afford this kind of technological innovation can then afford to jump up in terms of like value capture, especially because it's not even about value creation. It seems it's about it seems that ICT makes it easier to capture value along the chain. And it's also like the great product to then pass on to countries with less resources, let's say, who then have to maybe even get into debt, or to sort of to viciously get into the vicious cycle of catching up. And then on the other hand, there's this winner takes most, and there's, I think, a lot of evidence that digitalization speeds up the winner takes most dynamic of globalization and global integration. But then the GVC literature and global value chains seem to suggest, because of this fragmentation of the technology has allowed for and decentralization of production, there's also opportunity for like more fairness in the system. So I guess, I mean, the way I think about it is that ICT can never be the solution in its own right. It is how we use it and how we choose as political subjects and how we negotiate it politically and socially is like, which way are we going to go? Because technology is just there, right? And I think, I mean, as a human society, we tend to overplace or like our responsibility and accountability to some external mechanism, whether it's like the government or technology or something. But of course, it is about how accountable we are to this technology and how we politically engage with it, and how where our responsibility of what kind of a society we want to live in. So this is sort of the two parts of the debate where I always feel like the social is missing, the political is missing, because in this whole very technology-driven debate. I don't know if that was your question, but this is the literature I know.
No, I basically wanted to know from the field data, the data you've collected, how did these two dimensions of the problem, the relationship between ICT and degrowth has connected? But we can talk later, and you can engage with others. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can also. Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize that. So my problem was that I started off with this annoyance theoretically that ICT was supposed to be a salvation for everybody. But then when I started talking to everybody, like nobody was really responding to my questions on technology. They just didn't care about technology. And then I was like, oh, I think I have a problem in my research design because I'm focusing all my questions on this, but then nobody really cares. And then I realized I'm going to let them talk about what they want to talk about, and kind of then I let them be driven more towards these like social reproduction efforts, which is why I've switched the focus, because I really expected them to be all bent on this technological advancement, and then they weren't. So I think I had to kind of give in some flexibility in terms of starting off from that premise, from the literature, but then I think really my empirical evidence disputed this assumption, like big time. Yeah, so that, yeah. And then the question on what kinds of firms I interviewed. So the products are very niche, from, as I say, from different kind of IT outsourcing services to even IT products, then to film production, for example, because a lot of companies come and record advertisements in films. In Serbia, it's a quite popular destination, for example. So they're offering services, but they're saying, but then we're figuring out how to do a lot on their very small budgets, and we're like figuring out how to sort of allocate resources so that it all works out, that it kind of looks good, but it's cheap, and they have a lot of pride in having this idea that they can really make a lot of savings for the clients. Actually speaking, when you mentioned India, there's a lot of actually Bollywood film coming in as well. Then when it comes to manufacturing services, yes, there's all kinds of like furniture metallurgy, and of course, some of these industries are dirtier than others, right? So it's not necessarily that they're sustainable, but they still reflect on themselves in comparison to the bigger polluters. So they're saying, okay, well, we're not doing a completely clean product, but still it's much cleaner than what we have around the corner here with this big factory polluting the river. So if we could organize somehow and get some of the resources in our direction, then we could think about maybe also more clean technologies. So, and then there's, I mean, the fragmentation is so big that I'm, in terms of like not specific sectors, that I'm struggling to even think of how to visualize this, because everybody asks about this. I think it's a very, because we're so used to thinking about sectors. I'm really struggling to conceptualize it by showing the level of nicheness. It could be like cellophanes for sausages, you know, it could be completely like tiny niche production things that you don't even know who came up with this idea or how, or like how the market demand was created for it. So yeah, I might want to think about this more, and maybe, yeah.
Okay, so any hand raised? Otherwise I can go on with my comments. Okay, so I have a couple of general comments and then one question probably. The first one is I'm coming from an engineering background, and I'm also like an innovation scholar as a training in my background. So, and when you approach innovation and theory, innovation scholarship in general is all about catching up, studying why people are not adopting innovation. So we talk about laggers, later adopters, and all this discourse, no? And I, in my PhD, I attached this. So I reinterpreted this tradition with the lens of the ideology of progress, the ideology of modernity, enlightenment, and so on. And I saw many connection between this idea of that history is a series of stages that each country is supposed to follow. So there is a fate, there is an ultimate goal. So there is a teleological direction of each state or community, and so there is a given road to development. And catching up or framing this idea that there are some countries that are leading and there are other countries that are following is really much compatible with this idea. And if you use another lens to understand this phenomenon, for example, if you use critical theory of colonial studies, you suddenly realize that this discourse was actually hiding a political agenda, which is not so. This idea of catching up was not designed to make all the countries at the same level, or to transform all the country and to make them similar. Okay, but in my opinion, and in the opinion of other people, like I'm talking about Arrighi works on world development, or world system theory, for example, or the work of Amir Samin and many other dependency theorists, we see the catching up process more like a sort of post-colonial mechanism, not to help other people to develop, but to enslave them into network of domination between core and periphery and so on. So this was my first comments. Maybe you might want to explore that part, because Serbia is part of non-aligned group of countries during the Cold War, then became after the fall of the Soviet Union the battleground of the first expansion of NATO. And now in these days we see the consequence of that project, no? So this was my first point. The second point that I found really fascinating, this cognitive dissonance that is emerging from your data, because what basically you are saying, and I experienced in my work as well, and the other researchers around the world, the fact that there is a public discourse that is still anchored in we need to grow, we need to develop, we need to boost our economy. But then when you talk to people, so when you talk to the people that are working, people in the factories, people, even manager, there is this enchantment. No, when you go to the micro level, people don't buy this this idea. They don't, most of people don't have a clear alternative vision in mind, but they know that something is wrong. So they have this impression, and I think this is super interesting. This must be investigated more. And you see many of these symptoms happening everywhere. It is the mass resignment movement in the US. No, there's like more than 2 million people resigned during the COVID because they thought that their job were meaningless. You have the work of David Graeber that published this book, Bullshit Jobs. So there is an increasing interest in this dissonance, this cognitive interest. What the hell I'm doing with my life? Working with this distributed industrial treadmill that's pushed me to do something that is totally meaningless. So these are my two general comments. Then I have a question, because my dad did this wonderful trip in the 70s to Yugoslavia, and they always talked to me about Yugoslavia as a paradise. You know, nice people, wonderful women from his perspective, self-managed factories. So this was like a big myth in Italy, self-managed factories. What's happened to this imaginary? How was the transformation of this idealistic paradise of self-managed workers? This was a really myth, or there was something interesting there that was destroyed, and what is left? Because I think this is can have a very important relation with this idea of post-growth economy in the periphery, no? Because self-management factories in Yugoslavia were actually really like an alternative imaginary to the state center Soviet kind of organization and the capitalist mainstream. So what's left of that experience?
Should I respond or? Yeah, thanks. Yes, music to my ears. Yes, I've been engaging in critical studies, but I have not been able to link it to my research because I'm saying there's this kind of vacuum when it comes to Eastern Europe. It's so hard to link it to either of the debates. It's something that I am very passionately reading about, and also, of course, following Graeber's work and everything. And I've been trying to think about how to link all these things to the context, which is completely monopolized and colonized by the catching up kind of hegemonic discourse. And so thanks for bringing that up. One thing that I think comes from my interviews is that a lot of these people are like, well, we don't want this huge company. We don't want to grow into a big company. I'm quite happy to, have my little company with some employees and do things at this level, but it's so hard to maintain it at a level where you're not pressured to like make it ever bigger. They don't have that ambition that like the grand narrative makes it sound like should be the aim for everybody or every human being. So I love how you frame it as a cognitive dissonance, because it really is a cognitive dissonance between like how you make meaning out of your own life and the macro narrative within which you live, which now it makes me think that could also be connected to another idea that I think about a lot, is this idea of hermeneutical injustice, because you don't even have the tools to explain what's happening to you and to your reality, because the whole discourse is monopolized by something that you don't relate to. So, and I think this is like a big issue in at least the former Yugoslav region, which then brings me to the self-managed factories. Amazing that you made this historical link. Well, there was a lot of debates even during that period, even between the West. I know a lot of UK scholars talked to this like Yugoslav School of Economics about the self-managed firm. And there's even like some people at my faculty still alive from that era and kind of like remembering it like fondly and thinking and telling me you need to read all this work. So it's something that I really want to get into. There is definitely, I think that I would say there is a certain nostalgia to it. I was visiting one shoemaking factory, which was kind of privatized from that era. And I remember the manager saying, look, we have parquet in the factory floor because it's mostly women employees, so they don't get cold on their feet and, like their ovaries or whatever, they were protecting their health, so they don't sit in cement, in the winter. And then there's also a lot of this idea that there's communal kitchens and cantinas everywhere. So then they buy off vegetables from their workers who are also growing their gardens. Like, so there is there's these kind of like nice micro stories that I think could be remnants of this logic of that era. But I think there's also a lot of that there's been also a big disruption again, and I think it is a very big epistemic injustice, because this whole psychosis of like nothing that ever came from socialism was good, we need to obliterate the past, and we do have a tendency to obliterate every past, that kind of changes. And then there's a lot, like, I would say only in the last few years there's been some kind of a resurrection of that. And maybe a tiny story that a friend of mine is doing research on this multiply failed privatization of a factory in Zrenjanin, which is in northern Serbia, and she's been following workers for 12 years, which I mean, they never really gave up. There's a lot of this kind of accumulated anger at like you cannot be doing this to me, you cannot be reducing the value of my work to some kind of a market price, but you're not even giving me the conditions in which I could prove my market price, because I mean, this privatizer came to actually strip us off assets. It didn't come to actually make a more efficient factory. So there's definitely a lot of political awareness at the micro level and anger, which then I think a lot of these other companies are also engaging with, because they have to juggle social injustice. So I'll try and link some of this stuff. It's very interesting. It's very interesting that you linked it to the post-growth agenda. This one, a professor of sociology who unfortunately died last year that I worked with, she died suddenly and too early. She always talked about tomorrow was yesterday. That was her main line, so I always try to remember that as well, because there's a lot of lessons from that period. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then we have Alejandro, who is working on critical management. He's doing a PhD in critical management, and we have on discussion, because he's becoming an expert in self-managed workplaces. And why I linked self-management factory with the post-growth? Because I think that there is in the polarization of the discourse between socialist models and capitalist model, there is also a polarization between the state and the private sector, which is also a fictitious. We have some other people talking about commons, working on commons, doing research on commons in the group. So what we know that it's not so simple. So it's not like that we have a state that owns like publicly the means of production, and we have private sector who is a single guy or board or a multinational corporation with the mandate to make profits. There are all sorts of complexity in between these two extremes. And one is the fact that the production can be seen as a common, like a common garden, like a common resource pool. So why a factory that is producing something with a social value cannot be also seen as a common? And if the hypothesis of our research is that if you frame the workspaces in terms of common, is more likely to produce post-growth imaginaries. So if you give the opportunity to the worker to decide what to produce, not only to have a voice in the condition of production, but also in what we produce, we hope, so this is the hypothesis, that these units can create a diversity, a plurality that can eventually lead to a post-growth society, whatever it means. This is the link that I think is worth to be explored. But I know that Alejandro wants to say something or question or comment.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. It was was really challenging as well to ask ourselves all these questions. So that's a really good exercise for all of us to really confront to a really complex reality, and a really complex international political economy. So I have a question related to what Mari was saying. When you say that the factories for the entrepreneurs, the people that you were interviewing, they were kind of avoiding technology updates or avoiding automation. Do you think there is a link between the past, like an historical link to this? Or is it, do you think it's like something that is related to the workers' subjectivity, for example? Or is it more related to the type of production that they are doing and the specific like productive systems that they rely on? So that's the first question. That's and it's mainly curiosity, no? But it's really interesting what you're saying, and yeah, it really connects with what Mario was saying. No, it's like on the one hand, like studying like how political economy works internationally, no, and then we see this kind of invisible division of labor between countries and this kind of race where countries come in different periods. Me, for example, I was really interested on reading like for my own these questions between Germany and Spain, for example, during the economic crisis, no. So, for example, there is a book of Varoufakis that is called "Do the Poor Suffer What They Must?" No. So you have all these power relationships, no, from critical theory, like. Are we, so one question, like one real question is, are we really doing international relations that are based on brotherhood or on domination? No, so that's that must be the first question, no. And because of the first, I guess that we are really limited on the second, no. So because we don't have like an international proper relation that aims to develop like a really fair relationship between countries and workers in countries. So then how can we frame technology in a way that is useful, no? Because we don't have control on our lives, we don't have control on our production, but at the same time we have the speed of the market, no? That it's kind of leading everything. So how do we deal with all these different levels, no? And how can we from different levels push it to change? I don't know. A lot of questions, but really interesting ones and really repressing ones, because I do feel like we have like stupid problems for we could live way better and focus on more interesting stuff, no? But yeah, thanks for studying that.
Thank you, Alejandro. Yes, I agree. We are having to do all this stuff, unfortunately, from the perspective of it seems to be pretty obvious on some level. So maybe the first question to answer specifically why there's this resistance to technology. So some of the more honest, let's say, people who felt comfortable to disclose were saying, we don't like this control that technology is imposing onto us, because once we introduce some of these softwares, then the government is like monitoring us closer, like we don't have the flexibility that we need in the system. And of course, you can always label this as this informality or wanting to kind of defraud the government. But then if the system is exploiting you and pushing you into further costs, there is a little bit of I would say an anarchistic kind of drive to it as well, to just kind of to be a bit more kind of anti-system rather than necessarily thinking you're getting something so big out of it. So I guess we could problematize that relationship between formal and informal. And also, I think it's also like when we complain how all these like phone updates or computer updates are constantly leading us to have to buy new things, right? They always still feel like once they get onto that bandwagon, it's indefinite. There's always the new cause, there's always the latest version, and that one's not compatible with the one before. So this whole turbo speeding of technology, digitalization and technology, which is of course driven by profits and even the government imposing new regulations to make more money and to get these companies with preferential contracts to distribute this equipment. I think that is part of the story of rejecting technology. So I think there's really a lot of this resistance is about not wanting to be forced into like an unnecessary speed of change, if that makes sense. So I'm always thinking, because I always think about, even the amount of reforms in the last 30 years is just insane. Like no country or international organization has conducted that many reforms in such a short time span. It is really all turbocharged. So people are kind of resisting that speed, which is not a human speed, there's only so many things you can change. And I feel like there's a lot of that also recognized in the discourse. And also, it rushes your lifestyle, because like once you become more productive, they're wondering what the point is, because then they don't have time for anything else. So they're not necessarily driven by that. So I think that could be like an issue of being controlled by a system where they feel is pushing them into a speed that they're not comfortable with, something like that. And then also mentioning this power context, and this reminds me of what Mario was mentioning with the non-aligned movements. Yesterday, when I was presenting part of this work to another workshop here in Budapest, I was asked, how come these firms, even without government support, without foreign investors, how come they have the skills to then sell these products and services abroad? Like, where do they get it from? And another work that I've done a bit before is like a working paper. We haven't really put any effort into publishing it yet, is that there's a strong legacy of this non-aligned Yugoslav socialism in terms of the skill sets, because it wasn't grabbed by the foreign investors because of the delayed transition. But people feel like there's a lot of engineering skills from that period. And even nowadays, if I travel, when I meet people from Congo, they're like, Yugoslavia, the only infrastructure that works in Congo was built by Yugoslavia, or something like that. So you're like, it's always nice to hear. And then for a lot of these people who started some of these private incentives and initiatives, they feel like they've had these amazing experiences from the non-aligned movement engineering kind of eras of big complex projects. And these are the tools and the skill sets that actually have made them now compatible to like do work for even data centers. So for example, one of the big issues, for example, building a data center, not everybody could even do the physical like the work with metals and connecting things so that fire doesn't get to, let's say, cords or something. These are really sophisticated services or like abilities and skills. But if you won't know how to do it unless you've done like a big electric dam project in Egypt or, whatever, where you had to kind of think about all this, even in the context of the 70s or the 80s. So there seems to be something that Yugoslavia, with this international exposure and social combination of international exposure and socialist skills, is something specific that wasn't there for the countries behind the Iron Bloc, which were more kind of closed and kind of, not as exposed. So now that like you both mentioned this component of the power versus brotherhood, right? Like the international relations, which in the non-aligned logic was more based on kind of like solidarity between the developing countries. And so I think there seems to be quite a strong historical legacy, which is kind of springboarding Serbia into global value chains here, which is an irony of fate, but also kind of interesting in its own right. Yeah.
Okay, nice. I don't know if Alejandro wants to reply back or no.
I think I have more. I have to spend time to to process all of this and to think about it.
Okay. Is there any other question from the others that been silent so far? No. Okay, you know that the next degrowth conference will be hosted by Zagreb City Council. So maybe that next year, maybe that one can be an occasion for us to join on do something together there. I know that the Zagreb mayor is an activist and has been embracing degrowth. And so there is something happening there. I don't know exactly because I have no contacts, but I'm excited to go and meet people in the sister country of Serbia. No, I don't know if there is any other question. Maybe we can close here and. I think this can be the beginning of an informal, at least for now, an informal collaboration. And I know that Alejandro and others are interested in the kind of work that they are doing, especially connecting with all this research that we are doing in terms of the commons, self-managed companies, or all the discussion between globalization, what level, for example, something that we haven't discussed, what level of complexity a post-growth organization is supposed to have or is likely to have in the future, we don't know. So because we have all different ideas of what the possible potential post-growth future will look like. So imagine so that we don't have like a clear, straightforward reply. So we are open to discussion. And again, congrats for the fantastic presentation and the level of the quality that you expressed in your research. We are looking forward to reading your paper, also your working paper, if you want to share with us. And feel free to drop an email, or all the members of the group are free to contact you and explore possible contact. And Alejandro, yeah.
I remember the question that I had, as I noted, but I lost it. So sorry about coming back to the presentation. You spoke about resources, and you spoke about the fact that sometimes, like foreign countries want to take resources, like paying far higher. So my questions were the following. So what is the role of the state there now? Like how do they actively participate on controlling this or protecting this? And then the other question is like, do you have like some reflections about the potential conflicts in terms of resources that? Yeah, how to anticipate this? How to engage with international, vision on this to anticipate like really big conflicts? Easy question.
Yeah, Alejandro, you make my life very easy. But no, thanks. Yeah, resources. So I think there's a lot of I would say obscurity in terms of how the state is managing natural resources. It is a political question that's been opened, especially, I don't know if you followed the Rio Tinto case last year with the lithium mining project in Serbia, which kind of like brought up this whole eco-populist, as they call it, movement. And now the project was abolished, but because apparently the lithium mine is very rich and lithium is in shortage, there's a lot of political pressure to kind of develop it. And of course, the narrative, it will be used to catch up, for Serbia to catch up with everybody. But there's a lot of political and kind of environmental resistance to it. So I think that has really brought environmental issues into the center of everybody's attention, and kind of like the conflict of like maybe the interest of the elites, in Belgrade may not be the same as interests of kind of like local people in certain areas, although there's this assumption that everything is in the interest of the country as a whole, which is again another way of kind of obscuring, these averages are obscuring like how actually for some people globalization is harming them while it's benefiting others. Although it's not really benefiting anybody in the longer run, because we're all gonna go to like burn up with the climate crisis and everything. So there's definitely like it's an important subject that is only beginning raised now, but it's actually also very dangerous, I have to say, because I mean, especially like within the subject of forest management and everything, I mean, there's been like a lot of even like threats. I know in Romania there's a big issue also. There's been even some murders, so it's like once you start digging up some of these secrets of capitalism, as I like to call them, I mean, it becomes like a very, very kind of dangerous zone. So I think it's a terrain to be not taken lightly and threaded, like kind of like it has to be thread easily. But of course, it's like a massive space for like political favor making and like state capture, and like because clearly this is where all the growth is actually coming from. It's kind of like extracting resources from certain areas and communities. So yeah, it's a very important, but I mean, I think Serbia is increasingly joining some of these international conversations. I mean, I know in like in Portugal, in northern Spain, there's been some of these mining project issues and debates and conflicts as well. So I think it's an interesting point for discussion. I'm actually going to go to Lisbon for a conference in the end of June. And I think I'll visit a friend in Coimbra who is a visiting professor there now as well. So I look forward to kind of getting to know that region. There seems to be quite a lot of interesting work happening in your part of the Atlantic, or if I can say it that way. And for the DM conference, I'll look into it because Daniela Dolinec, she's a deputy mayor of Zagreb. She's a friend and she's an academic. She's a political scientist and she does a lot of this work as well. So I'll ask her, and then maybe we can also think she's great as well, like really talented researcher and academic who is now in policy and like deputy mayor. But I think there's like probably a lot of room for fruitful exchange between policy and activism as well. So I wasn't aware, but thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, and then if you're visiting Coimbra, we are just less than 3 hours from Coimbra. So maybe if you want to come and stay with us a couple of days, you are welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have to think about how much time I'll have, because I think I'll only have like maybe 3 days in total before my conference starts in Lisbon. So, but I'll definitely go to Coimbra. So let me get back to you closer to the day to maybe I can come visit at least for like a day or whatever. We could have lunch, or
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sonia, and thank everybody for participating. And we will edit the video if it's okay with you, and we can put it on the YouTube, so we can circulate it through our social media. So thank you very much, and keep in touch, and good luck for the future. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Thanks so much for this opportunity. Nice to meet you all. Bye.